So you've configured your settings and you've learned the controls of World of Tanks. You are now ready to jump into the game. But first, you need to figure out how you want to play the game. World of Tanks is a game of nuance. There are many different factors of a tank that you need to take into account to make a decision of what kind of tank you want to play. Thankfully, Wargaming has given these choices some structure in the form of the different tank types within the game. But even with this added system to try to add some organization, the amount of different tanks and tank types in the game can still be a bit overwhelming to newer players. So grab your notebooks and join me in another episode of the Tank Academy. There are 4 different tank types and 1 type of brainless troglodytes that we are going to discuss today. The different classifications are light tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks, tank destroyers, and SPGs. Light tanks are the forward scouts of World of Tanks, sacrificing all of their armor and most of their firepower capabilities to gain speed and spotting ability. There are 2 main different types of light tanks that are in the game: passive light tanks and active light tanks. Passive light tanks are tanks that, compared to their active counterpart, have worse firepower and sometimes worse mobility, but have the upper hand on vision and are usually smaller tanks physically. These light tanks like to sit in a bush while not being spotted and play a sneaky role in the form of spotting the enemy without the enemy knowing where they are. Take for example the tier 8 French light tank, the ELC Even 90. This tank has an absolutely atrocious gun and has fairly average mobility compared to other light tanks, but is so insanely small and has such good spotting ability that it can sit in a bush and is incredibly hard to get spotted itself while maintaining its ability to spot enemies very well. The other type of light tanks are active light tanks. These lights have better guns and are usually faster than their passive counterparts, but are much larger and thus easier to hit and or spot. These lights prefer to use their speed as their primary spotting mechanism rather than purely relying on their sneakiness. These light tanks also usually have the firepower to at least be able to pose a threat to larger mediums and sometimes heavy tanks. The biggest example of an active light tank is the tier 10 French ELC 105. This tank has absolutely abhorrent view range, but is the fastest vehicle in the entire game, allowing it to compensate for that terrible view range. Its gun is also absolutely infuriating, and I hate it with every fiber of my being. One final note, these 2 classes of light tanks are not mutually exclusive. Passive light tanks can still play an active role and vice versa. It's just that certain tanks are more suited to one style of play than the other. Medium tanks are the all-rounders of World of Tanks. Their guns aren't terrible, but they aren't punching through heavy tanks like paper. Their mobility is workable, but they still cannot hold their own with light tanks. Their armor is usually able to absorb a shot or 2, but is usually not something to rely on. Medium tanks are not the best at any given statistic or situation, but they also aren't the worst. They are the Swiss Army knife of World of Tanks. Medium tanks are designed to be a support class, staying on the second line behind the heavies. This balanced playstyle makes medium tanks a great choice for newer players, as they are often quite forgiving to mistakes that noobs are bound to make every once in a while. Certain mediums will value speed, armor, or a gun over the other statistics slightly, but they all generally behave in a similar way. A tank that can put itself into any given situation and be okay at it, not great at it, but not terrible either. Heavy tanks are what most people think of when you say tank. A giant lumbering mass of steel whose primary purpose is to absorb as much damage as possible. Most heavy tanks are very well armored, but are quite slow compared to other tank classes. They are designed to be frontal assault vehicles and can often be the difference maker in a game if an experienced player is behind the wheel. These tanks often have larger guns that deal more damage per shot but are quite inaccurate. They are designed to be close-ranged brawlers, getting up close and personal with the enemy so that their poor speed and often inaccurate weapons do not affect them as much. If I had to give heavy tanks 2 distinct categories, I would say there are city heavies and ridgeline heavies. City heavies, such as Soviet and Polish heavies, are designed to have as much armor on their frontal hull and turret as possible. They are built to trundle through streets and wreak havoc on anything unlucky enough to cross their path. If they are put into a more hill-based or open position though, their wildly inaccurate and less flexible guns will often put them at a disadvantage compared to other heavies. The other category of heavy tanks are ridgeline heavies. These tanks put most of their armor on their turrets, and their flexible gun arc makes them right at home on a hill. These tanks are often more accurate than their Soviet counterparts, but usually have lower damage per shot or lower damage per minute than the more city-oriented heavy tanks. American and British heavies are usually the more hill-oriented heavy tanks, but they can also perform well in a flatter environment, just usually less so than the Soviet and Polish heavies. Tank destroyers are the snipers of World of Tanks. They usually have below average speed and armor, but fantastic guns. If you want to absolutely laser some scrub from 3 million miles away, then tank destroyers are for you. A tank like the French Tier 5 M10 RBFM is a great example of a traditional tank destroyer. It is fairly slow and has nearly no armor, but its decently accurate gun with fantastic damage per minute allows it to shred its opponents from a long range. Not all tank destroyers are designed to be snipers, however. There is also the subsection of assault TDs. Assault tank destroyers are a mix between heavy tanks and TDs. These tank destroyers are incredibly slow, usually even more so than traditional heavy tanks. And they also, most of the time, do not have a fully rotating turret. They either have a fixed cannon, or their turret only turns a certain amount to the left or right. They sacrifice any form of mobility to gain the armor of a heavy tank and the fantastic gun of a traditional tank destroyer. One of the best assault TDs in the game is the Soviet Tier 7 Su-100M1. This tank has no turret, and its gun has a very limited arc within its fixed structure. But its fairly good mobility combined with a wild gun that has great damage per minute but pretty shit accuracy makes it a top tier brawler. Assault TDs are meant to be side by side with heavies, at the front lines and pushing the tempo of the game. Okay, first of all, fuck these things. Don't play them, don't even think about playing them. They are a stain on the resume of World of Tanks and are destroying the game. With that said, artillery just sits at the back of the map, lobbing shells at enemy tanks without giving the enemy tanks any chance of fighting back or defending themselves. The shells do insane internal damage to the tanks and stun the crew, basically making the tank unplayable for sometimes upwards of 30 seconds. They are absolutely awful for the game, and I think they just need to be either removed entirely or heavily nerfed. I'm not going to talk about them anymore. I'm getting sick already just from this little bit. Oh my god, Artie, it's so gross. So those are the 5 different types of vehicles in World of Tanks. Each one plays a different role in the game, and it gives the player plenty of choices for how they want to play World of Tanks. If you want to be fast or sneaky, play a light tank. If you want to plow through a flank and ruin tanks along the way, play a heavy tank. There are so many ways to play the game that there isn't ever a time where you haven't tried a new playstyle or tank. So, yeah, that's about it. I'm Unbearable. See you next time. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out my other videos. If you didn't enjoy this video, then mortar strike my house or something, man, I don't know.